Right, we're going to reconvene our morning meeting and welcome Secretary Moore back into the committee. Thanks for coming on this 2 days in a row.
You're welcome. See if I can get my screen share working. For the record, I'm Julie Moore, the Secretary of Natural Resources, and I have a couple of different pieces I'm going to try to address here in fairly short order this morning. And then I'm glad that TJ Poor from the Department of Public Service is here and able to talk in more depth about some of the data we have available regarding the thermal sector. But thought I'd start just with a reflection on the charge that's contained within the Global Warming Solutions Act that is sort of driving the Clean Heat Standard Initiative. A little bit of an overview of how the Climate Action Plan envisioned the thermal sector would be handled. Address some points of concern I have with S5 as currently drafted, and then end on what will hopefully feel like a positive note by going through some of the ongoing implementation efforts that the agency and more broadly the executive branch is engaged in. So hopefully this is nothing new to anyone, but the Global Warming Solutions Act was enacted in September of 2020. The first meeting of the Climate Council took place in November of that year, and we adopted the initial Climate Action Plan in December of 2021. So we've had that initial Climate Action Plan on the books for just about a year and a half right now. And the charge to the Council through the Global Warming Solutions Act in developing the Climate Action Plan was to prioritize the most cost-effective, technologically feasible, and equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction pathways. And then what I've listed there, just for your reference, is the series of specific charges that were included in the Global Warming Solutions Act that absolutely go beyond greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but thinking about smart growth, adaptation and resilience, carbon sequestration, and effects on marginalized and rural communities. So the Climate Action Plan, as I heard Rich Cowart talk to this morning, does in broad strokes seek to cut climate pollution by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And that's also approximately half of 2005 levels, as you probably recall from the greenhouse gas inventory yesterday. It all matters what's being measured relative to what, but it's significant reductions that are sought over the next 6 or 7 years. The Climate Action Plan strives to prioritize those who are most affected. We worked hard to coordinate the development of the Climate Action Plan with the Comprehensive Energy Plan that was being worked on in parallel by the Department of Public Service. We'll update the Climate Action Plan at least once every 4 years. So our initial update will be completed in the summer of 2024. And then there's an implementation section, which is intended to inform decision-making by the General Assembly. And then finally, and I'll speak to a little bit more at the end, the Climate Action Plan does speak to the need to have a framework for measuring progress over time, and can talk a little bit about the work we're doing in that space.
Representative Sibilia.
Yeah. So can you just talk a little bit about just the mechanics of the council itself, where it's at, the number of councilors that are there, the terms, what's happening with the council itself?
Well, flip back up to this. The council is comprised of 23 members, 8 members of the administration, 8 members who are appointed by the Speaker of the House, although currently we only have 7 of those 8 appointees. All of the House terms expired in, I think, October of this past year. About, I want to say 5 of the members ultimately asked to be reappointed and 3 stepped down. 2 of those 3 vacancies have been filled. Currently, we have not received an appointment to represent the fuel dealers. And so obviously that's a challenging or a missing piece of interests and expertise within the council currently. And then there's 7 members appointed by the Senate Committee on Committees. Each of those members appointed by the General Assembly has a set of expertise that they are intended to represent, interests or expertise that they're intended to represent, to give us a diversity of perspectives. I think you will hear and may have even read in Digger this morning that there continue to be real concerns about whether the counselors actually represent a diversity of Vermonters in terms of lived experience, geography, economic background, racial makeup, et cetera. And so that's something we continue to wrestle with and work on.
So in addition, can you just talk, because this committee did not work on the Global Warming Solutions Act. So just to give a little bit more shade, can you just talk a little bit about the 5 subcommittees and how that work rolled out and then rolled back up into the climate action plan and what the participation in those subcommittees was like?
Sure. So the work of the council is supported by 5 subcommittees, 4 of which were established in the initial enabling statute, which were a cross-sector mitigation committee that really looks at greenhouse gas emissions reductions, a rural resilience and adaptation subcommittee that is very much focused on how we get to landscape level resilience, an agriculture and ecosystem subcommittee that was focused both on our working lands and the role they can play in making a resilient landscape, but also opportunities for carbon sequestration, and then a just transition subcommittee that was focused on making sure marginalized and underrepresented Vermonters' voices were heard by the council in developing the plan. In addition, the council determined to have a science and data subcommittee so that they could have some additional or particularized technical experts reviewing certain reports that very quickly get very weedy. Subcommittee memberships were opened more broadly. Every counselor was expected to serve on at least one subcommittee. Some served on multiple. Each subcommittee is chaired by someone from the executive branch and one of the legislative appointees. We solicited interest and applications from Vermonters interested in serving on subcommittees, and gave ourselves some guidelines about how many members would be workable, and have done one recruitment since to fill vacancies as they've arisen on our subcommittees or particularized needs. In general, during the throes of developing the climate action plan, these subcommittees were meeting monthly or biweekly, and at some points even weekly. I think you would hear from people serving on them that it was an incredible workload that they took on during that time and unsustainable, which also is reflected, I think, in some of the turnover we've seen since. Since the adoption of the climate plan, the work of the subcommittees has slowed somewhat. There are a number of technical analyses that ANR has contracted for and continue to rely on review and comment and feedback from relevant subcommittees and ultimately the Climate Council as we move through those work products. But it's a different role now than it was in the development of the plan.
What is that role now?
So it's really,
Opinion.
yeah, it's looking at these technical work products and providing advice. Frankly, implementation I see as the work of the executive branch. The Climate Action Plan gives us a roadmap or a framework for pursuing implementation. But at this point, the subcommittee role becomes more advisory, but also helping us make sure that we're collecting the information they will need and conducting the analyses that will be required to update the plan in just a year and a half's time.
Thank you.
So this chart, I think you've probably seen a couple of times now. Again, just different ways to slice and dice. The orange band on the figure on the right hand of the side of the screen represents the thermal sector and the reductions over time. The statistics I have on the left-hand side there, I've taken from the Pathways Analysis Report, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. But are specific to the thermal sector as opposed to the reductions shown in the chart on the right, which are overall greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that in general, the thermal sector expected thermal sector reductions or required thermal sector reductions are generally consistent with the overall greenhouse gas reductions expected under the Global Warming Solutions Act, but actually, if anything, a little bit more aggressive.
Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, Secretary Moore. So I heard you say that you're going to be talking about these with the Pathways report, but the percentage emissions reductions, That is different than what was in the Global Warming Solutions Act, what you've listed there, and different years. So it's a different scale. So I'm worried that people might be confused by that. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the pathways report, ultimately the target that we are looking to achieve are the targets or the requirements established from the Global Warming Solutions Act. So for 2040, the requirement is that or 2030, excuse me, the requirement is that we achieve a 40% reduction as compared to 1990 levels. The pathways report sort of took a current status quo, which is the 2018 levels, and it shows that the reductions that are required as compared to our 2018 levels, which are in some instances higher than where we were in 1990. So the climate action plan looked at each of the different sectors. So the building thermal sector, transportation sector, agriculture sector, et cetera, and developed a set of pathways and strategies for addressing greenhouse gas emissions from those sectors. In the thermal sector, there were a half a dozen different strategies that were recommended. Rich Cowart spoke to several of them this morning, including dramatically expanding weatherization, the development and implementation of a clean heat standard, looking at other ways that can drive less carbon intensive heating practices, incentives for the adoption of what are now being called clean heat measures under S5, instituting a rental property efficiency standard, and then regulatory code updates to ensure that the building code for new construction is consistent with what we're trying to retrofit existing construction to achieve. Also, I just think it's important to keep in mind the analysis of the clean heat standard that was actually included as part of the climate action plan. It was limited, and much of the work, and I heard Rich speak to this morning as well, has really been done subsequent, both by a sort of self-identified working group convened by the Energy Action Network, as well as the General Assembly and the work that was done last session around H715. And specifically within the Climate Action Plan, it says in regards to the clean heat standard, we didn't have enough information to evaluate the impact. We believed equity considerations could be considered based on program design, but it would need to be intentional, and we weren't able to comment on the cost effectiveness. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk specifically about the pathways analysis report, because this is how we figured out exactly how much of what we needed to do. It's a scenario modeling tool and really helps give that sense of the scale and pace of what's needed to achieve the emissions reduction requirements. Specific to the 2030 building thermal sector reductions, the pathways report did raise a couple of flags that are worth keeping in mind as we talk about the rest of this. One related to workforce. I think that is going to be a really significant challenge. The EAN report, for example, noted that we currently have about 770 weatherization workers in Vermont. And to achieve our ultimate goals, we need more than 6,000. So this is a really dramatic increase in the number of workers and businesses needed in these spaces. And then also just thinking about the pace and scale. It's important to look at supply chain concerns, but also financing to help make those initial costs of upgrades affordable. And Rich spoke to on-bill financing as a tool in that toolbox, but that may be a challenge for lower income Vermonters.
Representative Stebbins and then Smith.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning. I just wanted to ask you with regards to workforce, if you're aware of the Climate Workforce Collaborative and the efforts that are going on there and things that are in the workforce bill. So just flagging that, yes, I think that is an area that is both positive because it's good paying jobs that Vermonters can do. And there are efforts to support that.
Agreed. And I think the challenge is just finding people that want to take those careers. Our unemployment rolls currently only have about 4,000 Vermonters on it. So it's asking people to make a transition that they may not necessarily be ready or interested to make it.
There are efforts underway for that too.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. Morning, Secretary.
Good morning.
Where and how soon can we get 7,000 additional laborers?
I don't have a good answer.
I don't think anyone does, but thank you.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes, Secretary Moore, do you know what the vacancy rate is for corrections right now?
I know that it is higher than the average across state government, but I don't know what their specific vacancy rate is.
And what is your vacancy rate?
We're running about 8 to 10%, depending on the timing.
And how about transportation?
I don't know.
Generally, government?
I think ANR is on par with most of state government, corrections and state police being the exceptions, where I understand that they have a significantly higher vacancy rate.
Is there any recommendation that we cut services in the state of Vermont based on the vacancy rates?
No, but I think it's challenging. For example, our agency is really struggling under the weight to fully implement all of the federal funding programs we have available. And I think there are at times limits on the throughput capacity of what we're able to achieve as a result of the fact that we simply can't find people to do the work. So the pathways analysis report assumes that emissions reductions between now and 2030 primarily occur in the residential sector. It notes heat pump technologies are not currently resolved in the commercial sector, and that they're really only capable of servicing an area of, I believe it said 500 to 750 square feet. And so I put up the thermal sector emissions by commercial versus industrial versus residential to essentially say that those reductions we're looking to achieve, that 40% range, really need to come from just the green portion of this overall pie chart. And that's reflected in the numbers of units of things that we need to do, from homes weatherized, heat pumps installed, heat pump water heaters, advanced wood heat systems, and homes that will be heated with biofuels. So between now and 2030, or by 2030, we would ideally achieve 120,000 homes weatherized, 177,000 heat pumps installed, et cetera. And at the bottom, for perspective, I just offer the numbers that were installed. These are totals for that 5-year period from 2015 to 2020.
Question.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes, Madam, thank you. Secretary Moore, with regard to the Global Warming Solutions Act and the requirements that are in there, what's the outcome of not weatherizing 70,000 homes, 69,000 homes by 2025? What happens as a result of that?
There's a legal cause of action that could have anyone who is any citizen who is concerned about our lack of progress take me to court.
And what would the court's remedy be? I think that was spelled out in the Solutions Act, and we heard about that this morning.
It's unclear. There are several, I think, options available to the court. If they believe that we have taken reasonable steps in the right direction, they could simply require us to continue along the current path. I think if they believe what we are doing is unlikely to achieve the requirements of the act in some reasonable amount of time, they could ask us to take a regulatory approach instead.
The reasonable steps is?
There is a reasonableness test contained in there.
Thank you.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. In 2025, 69,000 homes weatherized. Does that mean 69,000 more have to be weatherized, or does that mean there's 20,000 now that have been, we need 49 more thousand?
Correct. So this is from the Weatherization at Scale Working Group. Originally, they had a straight line between where we sat at the end of 2021, which is about 30,000 homes that had been weatherized at that point, and the 120,000 needed by 2025. There were some real concerns expressed by partners within the Office of Economic Opportunity at DCF that runs the low income weatherization program, as well as our community action partners, and resulted in this more exponential curve being shown. As you will see from this graph, based on that recommendation, we will miss the number of weatherized homes by 2025, with projecting something closer to 48,000 homes weatherized. And that feels like frankly, the bounds of reason of what we're able to accomplish. Vermont is currently predates the very significant commitment of weatherization funds the governor and the General Assembly made last session through ARPA. But prior to that, Vermont was weatherizing about 2,000 homes per year. And you can see that we need to scale up to weatherizing almost 20,000 homes per year.
So with the labor force that we have right now, how many are there in that labor force? Do you know?
The number I have is from the EAN report, and it said there are 770 people.
Do you know how many more we would need?
Also working from the EAN report, it estimated 6,200 total. So that would be about 5,500 additional workers.
We can do this.
So I have a question about how does one count the number of homes weatherized?
So that may be a question that TJ can help answer, but both Efficiency Vermont and DCF through their Office of Economic Opportunity are keeping track of that information. There isn't a single database, is my understanding, where that information exists comprehensively, but we do have the ability to sort of gather that information from partners and add.
But if you didn't qualify for Efficiency Vermont, you wouldn't show up in their data.
Correct. If you were doing weatherization wholly on your own with no incentives from Efficiency Vermont, that would not show up in that data.
I wonder how many people be in that bucket.
Count for one.
No, I'm a two. Small sample size. All right.
And just for perspective, about 3/4 of all of Vermont's existing housing units will need to be weatherized by 2050 to meet the requirements of the Act. The other thermal sector measures that are included in the pathways analysis really focused on increasing use of biofuels and advanced wood heat. Ultimately, in 2050, just to keep this in mind, wood heat and biofuels are projected to serve about 20% of the residential energy demand. And expanded use of biofuels is really the primary driver of reduced emissions from the commercial and industrial sectors. So this is another slide I know you looked at yesterday, and just want to pause here and acknowledge, I agree with this slide. This is not the issue I'm trying to raise and expressing some concerns about the design of S5. Those long-term benefits associated with making this transition are real and they're impactful. And really the challenge is how we get there, particularly in the first handful of years. We know that you have to make these upfront investments in order to accrue those long-term savings. And this is looking at the costs, which are what's below the line, and the benefits that accrue, which is what's shown above the line. And the area that I want you to focus on is this red hatched area. And that represents the period of time where the costs are outpacing the benefits. So ultimately, your fuel costs may go down, but it will require an upfront investment in order to lower that fuel bill. And we need to be very thoughtful about how those costs are spread across society. So S5 directs that the annual requirements for clean heat measures be set at a pace sufficient to meet the thermal sector reductions required by the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so going back to the Pathways report, roughly, that is 85,000 homes that need to be weatherized between today and the end of 2030, 145,000 heat pumps installed, and 125,000 heat pump water heaters. These, I have unitized costs for each one of those. Those were obtained from the Department of Public Service based on data they gather on average cost. I would offer that the heat pump cost is likely low because it assumes a single heat pump can serve most homes, and we know that that is not always the case. But if you add those numbers together, that gross upfront cost, just for the stuff, is about $2 billion. It doesn't include administrative costs, so nothing in state government to sort of administer these programs, nor the cost of the default delivery agent. And for perspective, Efficiency Vermont has indicated that their administrative costs are about 20% of the overall program costs. This is not dissimilar from what the Pathways report found, which estimated that the net costs in the residential sector, so they accounted for some of those fuel savings, ended up being about $1.6 billion.
Actually, I'm sorry, but we're really at capacity for the room. I'm sorry. You need to stream us on YouTube. What's that?
Oh, I felt like at the other rooms, they just said that people could put masks on if they needed to.
That's not what we're doing. Sorry. Oh, it looks like Dylan's stepping out, so you can stay. Dylan just stepped out.
Allison.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah.
So just as a gut check, I compared it to the number in the Pathways report, which was able to take account of fuel cost savings and suggested this net cost was 1.6 billion between now and 20.
Representative Torrey.
I know we have a lot more cost and savings analysis planned for this. But I'm just curious, I think a lot of us have systems that need to be replaced. So how does that get factored in?
That's a great question. So I think that's part of the challenge here, right? I talked to Efficiency Vermont and they indicated that generally their incentives for clean heat measures for low and moderate income Vermonters are about 75%. I think the timeline that's envisioned by S5 means you're not always meeting people where you're at. You're right. If I was going to replace my furnace anyways, or if they came out to service my furnace and said, within the next couple of years, this thing is on the way out, a several $1,000s tax incentive or rebate would be very attractive in helping me to select a technology over the other. The pace of the change that's required in order to meet those 2030 requirements, I don't think only meets people where they're at. We need people who are willing to swap out a functional system for a clean heat measure in order to achieve the magnitude of what's required, which is this 145,000 heat pumps installed. There's nothing that requires people to do it, as you've heard repeatedly. This isn't a requirement that flows to homeowners. So the only way to incentivize people to do it is to make them very low cost, where hopefully those fuel savings quickly outweigh any upfront investment homeowners might need to make. And that's why in developing my own cost estimate, I assumed that a 90% cost share would be required. Homeowners, I'm sure, will pay a portion of it, particularly faced with the current high fossil fuel prices. But I think it's a small portion given the aggressive nature of the schedule. And so if you assume homeowners bear 10% of the cost, that means the unmet need of that $2 billion in upfront investment is about 1.8 million.
Yes.
Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Secretary Moore, can you go back to the previous slide? Notice this is the gross cost, and this has gotten a lot of airtime. Can you tell us what your analysis is of the savings, fuel savings that Vermonters will experience equivalent to that, to those costs?
Yeah, that's what's shown down below. There's about $400 million in estimated fuel savings during this 10-year period, according to the Pathways report. Because that's a net cost number at the bottom of the slide.
Great.
There is also significant federal funding.
Sorry, where was that analysis? Where's that analysis been done? The Pathways report. Great.
This report. Yeah, I can send you this.
That'd be great.
Okay. I will never remember to do that. There is also significant federal funding that is available right now. The ARPA commitment that the General Assembly made previously, and I'll provide a little update on that at the end, under the IIJA, where the Department of Public Service is slated to receive about $60 million that can be used for incentives. Under the IRA, there is a number of different tax rebates and other initiatives that will be very attractive to certain types of consumers. And then we've been the beneficiary of several different tranches of congressionally directed spending. I've assumed that in total, those will work out to be about $75 million a year of benefits for each of the next 8 years, reducing that upfront cost by about $600 million. So then the total needed investment remaining would be 1.2 billion. If you
excuse me.
I'm really struggling with some of your analytical points. For example, the 90% cost share. Having worked at Efficiency Vermont, regardless of the customer that we supported, we would not have been able to give a 90% incentive. I mean, that's really the weatherization agencies. And so I'm wondering how you think that would ever pass muster. I mean, it's just simply not a valid assumption in my perspective. So my question is, do you know what, like, for Efficiency Vermont incentives, what percentage those typically cover for most Vermonters if they're doing, say, a weatherization project? Is it 90%?
It is not. What I'm saying is because of the pace, the way S5 is structured, it needs to meet the 2030 requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. So it needs to endeavor to achieve 85,000 homes weatherized. What I'm saying is in order to incent enough Vermonters to weatherize their homes, a very high cost share will need to be provided because we're not meeting people where they're at. It's probably less true for weatherization than it is for heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, where if you have a functional heat pump or water heater in your basement that has many years of useful life left, it will require a very high incentive to encourage you to change it out. The way we're going to drive people to change it out is through the sale of clean heat credits that we'll be able to use to provide incentives. And so because S5 is required to meet these targets, it is going to effectively require incredibly generous incentives to achieve the rate of implementation that's established here.
So I understand your point. Over the next, 5-10 years, one of the things we heard from other testifying people is, we've seen what the cost of an iPhone has been market-wide in terms of decreased cost, electric vehicles. Did you factor in what, I personally know of an NREL report that shows what the assumption is for heat pump costs over the next 2020, 2030, 2040. Did you factor in all those market externalities that are expected to make this a shift?
I did not.
Thank you.
So at this point, I believe there's $1.2 billion of remaining investment need. There has been considerable discussion about how much fuel suppliers will absorb of that cost rather than passing it along to their customers. I have assumed 25%. I have certainly heard from the Fuel Dealers Association that they don't think that that is practical, but I've left that assumption in place, indicating it will be a smaller number. But that would make the total investment needed, upfront investment needed through 2030 at $900 million. So if absent dedicated state revenue, it's reasonable to expect that the rest of that cost would be passed on to customers in terms of fuel sales. So if the clean heat standard takes effect January 1st, 2026, as is currently envisioned, there's 5 years to achieve the 2030 Global Warming Solutions Act requirements, which would result in a cost of about $180 million a year. And then I simply divided the amount of fossil heating fuels sold per year in Vermont by that $180 million to develop a 70-cent per gallon estimate. I know that estimate makes people wildly uncomfortable, but I think absent the kind of comprehensive analysis that I believe is essential to understanding what the cost of the bill will be, this is frankly about as good as we can get right now.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. One of the interesting pieces that I think is we have a climate council, which was the sort of legislative effort, and then we have ANR, which is an administrative entity. And we have a climate action plan that has been doing analysis. I guess I'm just curious. I'm concerned with this analysis. I don't understand why you chose to take it when you have a climate council that has hired, people to do analyses. And you said you need a really thorough analysis, but then you just said you didn't include any of the what we have seen repeatedly in history for changes and reductions in market costs. So I would beg you moving forward, if you're not completely comfortable with your analysis and that it is at the level of scrutiny that everybody else is getting for S5, I would beg you to please lighten up on it because there are many, many issues with it.
I don't disagree. We are doing the work now. But I feel like by moving forward with this legislation, absent the benefit of the reports we are currently contracted for, I have no choice but to offer the best available estimate based on the best available data. I think to do anything otherwise is a disservice to Vermonters.
If you don't feel like it's a disservice that we have not addressed how we heat our homes for people who have just seen their prices go up $2, $2.50, depending on where and when. You don't think it's a disservice to not do anything for them and to continue to punt it? Our first climate action plan report was 2006 under Governor Douglas.
I'm not arguing to do nothing. And I think if you let me finish my presentation, I'll show you the pieces that are in motion right now. Okay. And just want to reflect back. The climate action plan did not have any information on the clean heat standard specifics. The language on this slide is the language taken directly out of the climate action plan in regards to the clean heat standard. I also just want to reflect back that there was work done in response to Act 62 of 2019 that looked at the fuel tax. The fuel tax is currently 2 cents per gallon. That raises about $4.5 million a year. Those funds are mostly spent on low-income weatherization, as well as a little bit of that money is allocated to buy heat. That report did recommend increasing the tax on the sale of fuel gradually over time to 4 cents in 2021 and 6 cents in 2023, but no legislative action was taken as a result of that study. So Representative Stebbins, this gets to some of your points. There are some pretty critical data gaps in what is currently known. Some of these are in S5, and then some of them are ones we are working to address. Fuel data, currently tax just asks fuel suppliers to report the number of gallons of fuel they sell. And it's everything all added together: heating fuel, propane, kerosene, and other dyed diesel on their form FGR 615. Sales of natural gas and coal are tracked separately, but I think this will impact the ability to establish clean heat credits based on the different carbon intensity of those fuels. We have been actively working with the tax department to disaggregate that data and believe they are about to publish an updated form. Understanding what the existing regulatory relationship is with obligated entities. Most of our fuel suppliers and wholesalers do not have any existing regulatory relationship with the state of Vermont, unlike Green Mountain Power or other electricity utilities that are regulated by the PUC. And depending on where those obligations land, it will be more or less that need to be brought into that universe. Also just want to talk a little bit about the need to support Vermonters who are queued waiting for clean heat measures. Obviously, not everybody will be able to have clean heat measures installed day one, and thinking through what will happen in the interim. And then some questions about the rate of deployment of clean heat measures. Can this be achieved? And I did hear Rich mention this morning the potential study that is referenced in S5. I think that that's a potentially important tool. It would provide information on the technical and economic feasibility of the implementation of clean heat measures. Unfortunately, it's a little bit of a regulatory, or it's a little bit of a dead end right now, in that it doesn't tie back into any action that the General Assembly is being asked to consider.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes, recognizing that we're coming close on time to prior to the end of your testimony, I would, the legislature right now, this bill is poised to come back to us for approval. All of the work that will be done to create the market and do the analysis is poised to come back to us before we approve. And so I'll be very interested. I hope you'll be telling us what specific aspects we should be also considering adding for when we have to vote on this before implementing it.
Some of these we spoke to yesterday, just issues of administrative complexity. There are clearly some differences between the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, that is sort of how we're going to judge if we're meeting the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and the proposed framework for clean heat accounting in S5. Calculating clean heat credits is challenging. I know members of my team have tried to dig into that, and I don't believe have been able to determine exactly how that system will work. Certainly, that is an effort that the PUC is committed to undertaking, but I think it's something to be aware of. And then finally, the carbon intensity of fuels, appreciating the intention there. I am concerned it adds an additional layer of complexity to an already complex undertaking. In terms of the equitable distribution of clean heat measures, the climate plan recommended that the legislature ensure that a high fraction of clean heat solutions were delivered to low and moderate income households in the early years. S5, and I believe in response to that, has indicated that each obligated party needs to retire at least 16% of clean heat credits from customers with low income and 16% from moderate income. Personally, I am not aware where those numbers came from, but would point out that based on data available through the tax department from 2021, about 71% of Vermonters would be considered, Vermont households would be considered to be low or moderate income. And so currently the only income sensitivity requirement in S5 is that at least 32% of clean heat measures are delivered to this 71% of the population. And know that this is a slide I think Jared spoke to yesterday when he was in that really focused on sort of the incentives and rebates that are available to help fill that red circle. And the challenge, and I was trying to speak to this a little bit earlier, is that I think where we're at is that those blue costs still exist, right? And if you have a functional heat pump, essentially these blue bars go away and you're looking at your average annual heating bill, not just the gap that can be made up with a grant or incentive. And so I think we have to think really carefully about how we best help low-income Vermonters cover that initial upfront cost, because otherwise it's comparing what may be a significant blue bar to an annual increment. Although we know the lifetime fuel costs will be significant, that next annual increment may be far less than what the cost of a new system would be. Just a couple words about public engagement and procedural equity. S5 has about 16 months for this process to take place. This includes pre-rulemaking engagement with stakeholders, drafting rules, the formal public comment process, and then preparing and submitting proposed final rules to the General Assembly by January 15th of 2025. As the head of an agency that does a lot of rulemaking, I just want to reflect, this is a very aggressive schedule. We have spent more time in this currently working on wake vote rules, which are far less reaching than what is envisioned under S5.
I'm just glad you didn't say far less controversial.
Nope. Pick that word carefully. Well, thank you. And I am concerned that this timeline is inconsistent with the guiding principles developed by the Just Transition Subcommittee, which talked about moving at the speed of trust, but also balancing planning and implementation around varied ways of learning, understanding, and being able to reach out and do meaningful engagement with different cultures and communities. I would offer S5 is really akin to the creation of Efficiency Vermont in 2020. It's critical that we understand those upfront costs and practical challenges in addition to the long-term benefits. I very much agree with your point, Representative Stebbins, and I think the challenge is we just haven't done that legwork yet. The climate plan did note that while the goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it is critical to understand the effects of these policies on Vermonters, especially those who struggle with the costs. And I just don't think we're there yet. The proposed timeline will impact procedural equity, and I do think it will limit opportunities for communities to participate in program planning and design. So the rest of my slides are sort of the good news story about the work that is underway, appreciating I'm probably up against it in terms of time. I've got about 5 or 6 slides that I can just flip through quickly to give you a sense of the work that's underway. First is the creation of the climate office. Sometimes I feel like that's an inside baseball win, but we're really thrilled to have a place, a centralized place within state government that can coordinate our overall efforts. There are 8 different agencies that are participating in the work of this climate office and the interagency team that they've sponsored, along with Leslie Ann Dupigny-Giroux in her capacity as the state climatologist. I see the climate office both essential to coordinating these efforts, but also tracking our progress over time towards meeting the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. So in the past 2 years since the Climate Action Plan was adopted, the administration has completed rulemaking on the Clean Car and Clean Trucks rule that were filed with the Secretary of State this past December. We are working to deploy about $250 million in federal ARPA funds and one-time state monies for things like weatherization, EV charging, home electrical system upgrades, municipal energy resilience, some flood buyouts, work in the agriculture sector, and work to expand urban tree canopies.
So we have a question that I don't know how long I've missed from Representative Logan, who's not with us. So I just want to give her a chance. Is she? Okay, great. Representative Logan. Go ahead. Oh, we can't hear you, Representative Logan. There's anything.
Sorry, I had myself muted. Great.
Okay.
Really appreciate you finding me my hand raised chair. It hadn't been that long, and thank you, Secretary Moore. My question was related to the standard set here in S5 to address the needs of low to moderate income households. So as I understand it, based on the analysis of personal income tax returns, it looks like 63% of Vermonters fall under the low income household threshold. 71% in total fall under the moderate income threshold. So my math says that 63% of Vermont households are low income and 8% are considered moderate income, between the 80% and 120% of median household income. Is that correct that I'm understanding that?
So I believe the definition of low income is less than 80% of median household, and I can get that information for you. I don't have that on my
I
slide.
see that. Okay.
So,
Okay.
But I
Okay.
think
71%. Okay, gotcha. So it's less than 63%, which is 100% of median household income. But seems like it's probably the majority of Vermonters likely fall under the low income threshold. It would be helpful to know that proportion exactly. And where I'm leading with this is essentially that we see that of the overall 32% of clean heat credits that need to be retired by through services provided to low and moderate income households, there's an equal split between low income households and moderate income households. And so I have two primary concerns here about the guidance that we're giving to the PUC in planning for implementation of the clean heat standards. My first concern is that what we know is at the outset, the majority of emissions reductions in the thermal sector will come from residential customers. So it does seem that given the proportion of low to moderate income households as customer households, 32% annually upfront might not be sufficient as we make this move towards greenhouse gas emissions in the thermal sector. We might, especially given, as you said, that there are $75 million a year over the next 8 years in federal incentives, many of which are targeted to these households. It seems like we could do more for low to moderate income households up front in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially because we see that from the Energy Action Network's presentation that we saw yesterday, that these households are very overburdened by their heating costs, which means that it's likely due to extremely inefficient heating systems or homes in need of weatherization. So my question to you is, do you believe that we need to be doing more for low to moderate income households in the early years of implementation of the Affordable Heat Act? And furthermore, do you believe that, you know, an equal split between low income households and moderate income households in terms of our guardrails for the PUC for these households is sufficient?
I'll take your second question first. I hadn't considered the split the way you're framing it before. I think that that is a really interesting consideration, and I will get those numbers to you because it does seem like it even as currently established, could weight moderate income households ahead of low income households in the way that the language is in S5. I am significantly concerned we haven't, that the bill doesn't do enough to think about low income households. And it's not just low income households that are participating, it's low income households that will see increased fuel costs. And I have a slide on that towards the end. I think, you know, while people may agree to disagree about how much fuel costs are likely to increase, I suspect that there are not really anyone that believes fuel costs will be unaffected by the clean heat standard. And so just thinking that through, particularly for Vermonters that access LIHEAP benefits, and that this will further diminish sort of their spending authority or capacity with those benefits is I think something that requires further attention and discussion. It would encourage the committee to hear from somebody like Paul Dragon with CBYO or Sue Minter with Capstone Community Action.
Okay, we really, we're going to limit questions from here out and try and get through the last few slides.
All right. So we talked about the federal funding that's currently being deployed. We're equally looking at opportunities that will exist under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. Both TJ's department and my agency have looked at opportunities that are available specifically to ours, but also know that there are other Vermont entities that may be able to pursue certain opportunities, including appreciating that the Vermont Bond Bank, VHFA, and VITA are currently teamed up and looking at pursuing a green bank funding opportunity through EPA. That said, federal guidance for many of these programs is under development, so we still don't know what we don't know, but did want to flag that earlier this week, ANR did submit a notice of intent to participate in EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. In phase one, we have been told we can expect a presumptive allocation of $3 million. And then there will be further funding opportunities that follow later in 2023. In addition, we are doing work related to technical analyses needed to understand greenhouse gas benefits, costs, and net savings over time of different climate initiatives, very much to the question you asked, Representative Stebbins. And work continues on the Municipal Vulnerability Toolkit. And we expect that will be completed this summer, and the governor's FY24 budget recommend and appreciate your support for those, and that the climate components of that budget that include funding to do education and outreach to support municipalities in implementing the municipal vulnerability index once it is complete. We are continuing to work on our approach to public engagement around climate action. We took what I feel was a fairly novel approach in reaching out to the public about the clean car and clean truck standards and really sought their input on what supporting policies would be needed to make that work successful. It was certainly a different way for asking for public input on a rule package the agency advanced, but felt like it created richer conversations. And we are coordinating our engagement work with the Environmental Justice Unit at ANR. And then this is just a little bit about some of the technical pieces that are underway. Looking to identify means to measure and track progress over time. We are in the process of developing an RFP, and I expect that will go out this summer to help us build that data management system. As you heard from us yesterday, we've been working on that update to the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecast, which should come out next month. We are undertaking an analysis to understand the cost implications of different thermal sector policies in meeting the Global Warming Solutions Act. Appreciating the timing of that work is imperfect with the timing of this body's work on the clean heat standard. We expect to have the initial report back on that effort in May or June. And then, as I noted earlier, we have been working with sister agencies and departments to get better data on the type and volume of fossil fuel deliveries that are being made into Vermont. Currently, there are parts and pieces of that live with at least different departments, and trying to make sure we have a comprehensive picture.
I think you should lead with that.
Lead with that?
Your phone.
I'd actually had them at the front, and I was like, I want to end on a positive note. So, because there's a lot of good work being done, and would just take the moment to say, this isn't an all or nothing proposition, right? And I think that's important to keep in mind. The clean heat standard is a really significant piece of policy, but with or without it, there is incredible work being done right now. It's not that we're just sitting around twiddling our thumbs, waiting for the next piece of legislation to drop, including in using these federal funds to help drive the implementation, take full advantage of them and drive the implementation of clean heat measures.
So it would be helpful to, for me, to have your positives translated into how they are affecting the clean heat measures.
So we're
not necessarily expecting that right now, but that would be super helpful.
So I would maybe can I answer your question or respond with a couple of questions of my own, which is we are updating as part of the work we have going on, and TJ may have this in his slide deck as well, but we're updating our business as usual case to account for some of these federal funding programs as best we understand them right now. So to say, absent a clean heat standard, essentially, what's the likely uptake going to be in Vermont over the next several years, simply by virtue of all this federal money?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the timing of that is May, April.
The study is going to be complete by the end of May or June for the final report, but the business as usual should be updated by mid to late April.
Okay, so I think we can get you, I'll get you that information as soon as we have it, but just know that we've asked that question too, just to try to put into an apples to apples comparison the impact that will have. And then the ultimate answer to your question, I think, is in the measuring and assessing progress tool, but that's further out. And part of our challenge is we don't have a great way to aggregate all of the things we're doing right now in order to be able to track progress beyond sort of these national, regional, and in some cases state data sets that Colin spoke to yesterday.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in the folks who've already implemented measures without being able to be counted, which may be a TJ question, but I think that's a really important piece of this as well. Did you have one?
I'm fine, actually, thank you, Madam
This is
Chair.
really helpful. Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one. So thank you for the presentation, Chair. This bill, it talks about, well, it's talked about as a heating fuel bill. But given like the interconnected nature of the fuel markets, are there mechanisms in this bill that ensure that it won't impact like processed fuels, like for maple syrup operation or like natural gas that's used like in for paper goods like West Rock up in Shelton?
That's a good question. And the answer is no, we don't have a way to make those distinctions. The framework is based on fuel type, not end use. And so at the highest level, we are able to make a distinction between thermal fuels and transportation fuels, but making a distinction between thermal fuels used to heat a building and thermal fuels used to run an industrial process, it is my understanding there is no way to make that distinction right now. And so while there wouldn't necessarily be anything required of maple sugar producers, for example, for fuel prices to rise as a result of a clean heat standard, it would in all likelihood affect the fuel, or I have no reason to think it wouldn't affect the prices of fuels they're using to run their businesses as well.
Thank you very much for your testimony today. You can't, we need to respect our next witness, ourselves and ourselves. So we need a 3-minute break. So we're going to take a 3-minute break.